Let me tell you something I've learned from a lifetime of watching, listening, rising, falling, and rising again. What we see on the surface is almost never the whole story. When we talk about nations, alliances, rivalries, and politics, we often talk in headlines, in loud, sharp words that try to explain centuries in a sentence. But behind those headlines, behind every handshake or hesitation, there's something deeper. There's a story about power, about fear, about love, about identity. So when someone says, why does Donald Trump show admiration for Pakistan? Or why does the United States appear so cold toward India? What they're really asking is something more profound. They're asking, what is the story behind the stage? What emotions, what history, what fear or favor is shaping the way these nations relate to each other? You can't talk about international love or international hate without first talking about interest. And you can't talk about interest without talking about insecurity. The moment a country starts rising, truly rising, not just in economy, but in confidence, in vision, in global presence, something starts to shift in the room. People notice, some cheer, some panic, and some pretend not to notice at all. India right now is not just growing, it's glowing. It's becoming something that the old systems never planned for. And you know what happens when something grows outside the box that was built for it? The box starts to break. And that makes people nervous. So maybe it's not about love, maybe it's not about hate, maybe it's about the fact that we are watching one nation step into its destiny and another trying to decide if it's ready to share the spotlight. That's not a conflict of war, that's a conflict of ego. And let's talk about Pakistan, because love is a powerful word, but so is strategy. When someone expresses admiration, we have to ask, what does that admiration cost? What does it buy? Is it love or is it leverage? Is it genuine or is it convenient? These aren't simple questions, and they don't deserve simple answers. But what I know for sure is this: truth always rises. Strength doesn't need permission. And real power, the kind that doesn't shout or beg or bow, it eventually commands respect, whether others are ready or not. So as we begin this conversation, I want you to hold this thought in your heart. The relationships between nations are just like the relationships between people. Complicated, messy, emotional, sometimes political, always personal. And if you really want to understand why things are the way they are, you have to be willing to listen past the noise and hear what's not being said. You know, people don't always say what they mean. And leaders, they almost never do. When someone like Donald Trump says he loves Pakistan, we need to pause, breathe, and look deeper. Because love in this kind of conversation is not always about affection. It's not about history or friendship. It's about what's useful, what's strategic, what moves the chessboard in their favor. And in the world of politics, love often speaks louder through actions than words. Let me tell you, when a powerful man stands on a podium and says, "We love this country," what he's really doing is sending a message, not just to that country, but to other countries listening. It's not a love letter, it's a move in the game. And what we're seeing is a world where these moves are being made out in the open, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with a sting, and often with consequences. So why Pakistan? Why now? You have to understand that Pakistan for years has been in this position, a country with internal struggles, but also deep ties to regions that matter strategically. Afghanistan, China, the Middle East. It's a nation that has influence whether people like it or not. And leaders, especially those who think in terms of advantage, see that. They say love because what they really mean is we might need you. We might need your airspace. We might need your silence. We might need your friendship when the cameras are off. That's not the kind of love you write poems about. That's a transactional love. And in global politics, that's the love that gets handed out most often. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with recognizing what a country brings to the table. Every nation wants to feel valued. Every nation wants to be seen. But when that love feels sudden, when it feels loud, when it feels like it comes at the expense of another partner, that's when we have to ask, what's the story behind this praise? Because while one country is being praised, another may be feeling the cold shoulder. And India, let's just speak the truth. India has been rising like the sun. You can see it in the technology, in the startups, in the global education system, in the way Indian voices are becoming louder, prouder, and more visible in every part of the world. This isn't a quiet rise, it's a bold, vibrant, deeply spiritual and intellectual rise. But not everybody is ready for it. And when you're not ready for something, you don't always attack it. Sometimes you just ignore it. Sometimes you give your attention to someone else, someone you think might be easier to handle, more pliable, less threatening. That's what happens when confidence walks into a room. It doesn't have to shout, but its very presence makes people choose how they're going to respond. And if they don't feel strong enough to meet that energy, they'll look away, or they'll look to someone else. This isn't about countries fighting. This isn't about enemies or alliances. This is about how the human ego plays out on a world stage. Donald Trump doesn't love Pakistan because he knows every citizen. He doesn't hate India. He fears what India represents. And that fear, let me tell you, is not always loud and violent. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's passive. Sometimes it shows up as silence when you expect a compliment or praise given elsewhere when it should have been yours. And yet India keeps rising. That's the part I love. That's the part we can all learn from. You don't need to be validated to be valuable. You don't need applause to keep walking in your truth. And you certainly don't need one person's love to know you're worthy. What you do need is clarity, because clarity gives you peace. It lets you see the situation as it is, not as it's being spun. So if you're someone watching all this unfold thinking, why is this leader saying these things? What does it mean? What did India do wrong? You need to hear this. India didn't do anything wrong. It did something right. It grew. It evolved. It stepped into a space that wasn't built for it, and then it built its own. And that makes some people uncomfortable. But that discomfort doesn't belong to India. It belongs to the ones still trying to adjust to a new world order. Sometimes people praise others just to avoid praising you. That's human. That's politics. But it's also temporary. Truth, real truth, has a way of surfacing, no matter who's trying to hold it down. And India's truth, its strength, its light, it's becoming too bright to ignore. When you walk into a room and people look away, don't ever think it's because you're small. More often than not, it's because you've become too big to ignore. And ignoring you is the only control they think they have left. And when we look at the silence surrounding India's rise, when we hear the praise being directed elsewhere, we need to ask, what is that silence hiding? What is the fear that's not being spoken? You see, fear doesn't always come dressed as panic. It's clever. Sometimes fear looks like diplomacy. Sometimes fear looks like shifting attention. Sometimes fear wraps itself in the flag of caution or foreign policy or economic alignment. But if you really listen, not just with your ears, but with your gut, you can hear the trembling behind the words. India is not a country that's waiting to be noticed anymore. That time is over. It's already here, already loud, already working, building, transforming. It's young, it's ancient, it's innovative, it's spiritual, it's many things all at once. And that kind of complexity, that kind of vastness, it can be intimidating because it can't be put into a box. It refuses to stay in the role it was once assigned. There's a myth that power is always about weapons or military bases or economic sanctions, but some of the greatest power in the world comes from the idea of who you are. And right now, the idea of India in the hearts of its people and in the minds of others is starting to change. And when the idea of you evolves, everything else starts to shift. So why the hesitation? Why the coldness from nations that once offered warm handshakes and louder praise? The truth is, when a country becomes self-sufficient, when it stops needing constant approval, when it starts choosing its own direction, it stops being easy to manage. And if you're someone who built your strength on controlling the narrative, watching someone else write their own story can feel threatening. Let's be honest, we live in a world that sometimes rewards obedience more than brilliance. And India is not playing obedient anymore. It's playing bold. It's rewriting trade relationships. It's investing in its youth. It's raising its voice on global stages where it used to whisper. It's no longer asking, can we join you? It's saying, we'll build our own table. And what do some global leaders do when they see that happening? They stay quiet. They pivot. They find comfort in relationships that are less challenging, less demanding, less confident. Because loving a country that's still finding its feet feels safe. But respecting a country that's already standing tall, that requires humility. And humility, my friends, is not something every leader knows how to wear. This is not just about America or Trump or any single nation. This is about an old world trying to adjust to a new balance. This is about what happens when the stories we've told ourselves no longer match what's unfolding in real time. And when those stories stop working, people get nervous. That nervousness becomes criticism. That criticism becomes policy. And sometimes that policy becomes punishment. But here's the beautiful part. The truth doesn't need to scream. It just needs to stand. And India, with all its complexity, its contradictions, its beauty and struggle, is standing. The youth are not waiting to be chosen. The entrepreneurs are not waiting for validation. The thinkers, the artists, the scientists, they're already moving, already building, already becoming. Fear doesn't know what to do with that, because fear thrives on control. And India is showing that you don't have to be anyone else's version of success. You can define it on your own terms. And when you do that, when you step into your own identity, the ones who were used to defining you, they go quiet, and that silence. Let me tell you something I've learned again and again over the years, not just from my own life, but from every story I've listened to, every heart I've sat beside. The most dangerous thing you can do to the world around you is learn how to define yourself. Not with their language, not on their terms, but by the truth that lives inside you. Because when you define yourself, truly define yourself, you become unshakable. And that kind of certainty, oh, it shakes the world. India is doing just that. We are watching a nation that is learning to speak not with borrowed words, but with a voice of its own. It's not imitating, it's not apologizing, it is becoming. And becoming is no small thing. Becoming is sacred. Becoming means you're walking forward, even when the spotlight isn't there. It means you are building not for applause, but for purpose. And not everyone celebrates that. See, it's easy to love a country when it's predictable, when it follows the script, plays its part quietly, and doesn't disrupt the balance of power. But when that same country stands up, adjusts its shoulders, clears its throat, and says, "We are not who we used to be," that's when the fear sets in for others. Because if India is growing, if it's evolving, if it's stepping forward, then something else has to make space. Something else has to give. And people, especially people in power, don't like giving up space. But let me ask you, who gave them ownership of that space in the first place? The truth is, no one owns the future. The future belongs to those bold enough to shape it. And right now, India isn't waiting to be invited. It's building, it's showing up, it's making space, not just for itself, but for the voices of its people, for the millions who have dreams bigger than what the world expected of them. And let me tell you, that kind of courage is rare. It's not about military might. It's not about numbers on a stock exchange. It's about a people rising with conviction, a people who remember their past but aren't chained to it, a people who are saying we can honor our traditions and still reimagine our future. That, my friends, is revolution, not through war but through will. Now, some people will question that rise. Some will misinterpret it, intentionally or not. Some will try to reduce it down to competition, rivalry, threat. But we know better, don't we? Because when a person reclaims their narrative, when they stop begging to be seen and simply become visible, others will always feel uncomfortable. That's not India's burden to carry. That discomfort doesn't belong to India. It belongs to those who are unwilling to accept change without trying to control it. There's something powerful about watching a country define itself from the inside out. It's like watching someone step into their truth after a lifetime of being told to shrink. It reminds me of people I've met who used to speak in whispers, and now they stand in their power and say, "I will no longer be quiet about who I am." That's what India is doing on the world stage. It's standing tall, not perfectly. No country is perfect, but boldly, authentically. And yes, there will be resistance, there will be criticism, there will be quiet little efforts to question every move, to dissect every decision. But that's how you know something important is happening. You don't attract criticism unless you've stepped outside of someone else's control. You don't stir fear unless you've begun to challenge someone's comfort. And when that happens, when you redefine yourself, you break every box they tried to keep you in. So let the questions come. Let the silence linger. Because nothing is louder than truth walking into a room and taking its rightful place. And right now, India isn't asking for permission. It's not waiting to be validated. It is defining itself through its people, through its innovation, through its pain and its healing, through its hope. And let me tell you, when you define yourself, you become a mirror. You force others to ask themselves, who am I without control over this narrative? That's why they turn their faces. That's why they change the subject. Because the most powerful truth is not spoken, it's lived. And India is living it. Love is a beautiful word. It sounds warm, it sounds safe, it sounds like something you'd want to believe. But love without depth, without honesty, without accountability, that's not love. That's strategy dressed up to look like kindness. That's convenience, pretending to be compassion. So when someone says, I love this country, especially someone powerful, you have to pause. You have to ask, why? What do they love? Who do they love? And most importantly, what are they gaining by saying it? Because here's the truth, love doesn't always come free. In politics, in diplomacy, in global affairs, love often comes with strings, invisible but very real. Love sometimes means you agree with me. Sometimes it means you benefit me. Sometimes it simply means you don't threaten me. And when any of those things change, that love, it goes quiet. Or worse, it turns cold. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what it means when a leader from one country says they love another, especially when that love feels louder than the love they show to others. Why would someone say they love a nation like Pakistan while offering silence or skepticism toward India, a nation on the rise? It's not because of ignorance. Let's not pretend world leaders don't know the difference. They know the numbers. They know the trajectory. They know the power and the potential. This is not about knowledge. This is about narrative. You see, when a country is still dependent, when its direction is uncertain, it's easier to shape, easier to sway, and that makes it comfortable. You can love it because it doesn't challenge you, but when another country starts charting its own path with clarity, with conviction, that's when things get complicated. That's when some people stop clapping and start calculating. And let's be clear, this is not about blaming one country or leader. This is about a larger pattern, a pattern where affection often follows interest, where admiration is offered not because of who you are, but because of what someone stands to gain from you. So when someone says they love a country, ask why. Ask what version of that country they're really in love with. Are they in love with the people or with the control they used to have over them? Are they in love with the culture or just with the access it gives to markets and influence? Are they in love with the values or with the ability to define those values from the outside? Because if you only love a country when it's quiet or dependent or willing to follow, that's not love. That's comfort disguised as connection. And yet we live in a world that falls for it again and again. We confuse alliances with affection. We mistake handshakes for heart. And we assume that because someone says the right words on camera, they must carry the right intentions off camera. But intentions reveal themselves not in speeches, but in silence, in what they choose not to say, in where they withhold praise, in where they avoid eye contact or shift the narrative or withhold respect. So ask yourself, when India rises, when it steps into its full height, who applauds and who goes quiet? Who shows up not just to benefit, but to honor? That is how you know the difference between love and leverage. True love, real love, is rooted in equality. It's grounded in respect. It doesn't flinch when you become strong. It doesn't shrink when you start shining. And most of all, it doesn't change its tone when you find your voice. So if you're watching the world stage and wondering why some countries get showered with warmth while others are met with suspicion, don't assume it's about who's better or worse. Don't fall into that trap. Instead, ask, who's easier to influence, who's safer to praise, and who's strong enough to be ignored because they no longer need validation. Because sometimes love isn't about truth, it's about timing. And if someone says they love you, but only when you're small, only when you're silent, only when you serve their story, that's not love, that's strategy. India doesn't need conditional affection. It doesn't need borrowed pride. What it needs, what every rising nation needs, is the space to be seen fully, not as a pawn, not as a rival, but as a partner, as a force, as a voice that belongs at the table, not because of someone else's charity, but because of its earned place. So when they say love, ask why. And when they say nothing at all, listen even closer. Let me say something that might shake you for a moment, but it needs to be said. They never really feared your pain. They never feared your poverty. They never feared your hardship. What they fear is your power. What shakes the room, what shifts the balance is not your suffering, it's your strength. It's easy to be adored when you're in need. It's easy to be pitied when you're behind. The world makes space for struggle because it keeps the system intact. But when you rise, when you succeed without permission, that's when the silence comes. That's when the headlines change. That's when the admiration turns to analysis. Why? Because you're no longer playing the role they wrote for you. You're rewriting your own story. And in today's world, when we talk about nations like India, we're not talking about charity. We're talking about change. We're talking about a nation with the brain power, the resources, the drive, and the vision to lead. Not later, but now. That's not a threat, that's a turning point. But power doesn't shift without resistance, and progress doesn't come without discomfort, especially not for those who have always been at the top of the table, deciding who gets to sit beside them. That's why when India builds, when India innovates, when India starts making global headlines for its potential instead of its problems, you feel the room change. And you should feel it, because what you're feeling is not rejection, it's recognition. You see, people don't fear you when they think you're losing. They fear you when they know you're capable of winning. That's what this is about. That's what all this noise is really about. The discomfort isn't with your past, it's with your future. Because your future doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait to be approved. It stands up, it shows up, and it speaks in a voice that no longer asks, "Do you see me?" but says, "You will hear me." Let's be clear, it's not about hating India. It's not about loving someone else more. It's about managing the balance of power. And when one nation begins to stand tall, unapologetically, when it begins to question old narratives, challenge old dependencies, and demand equal respect, the world has a decision to make. Will it welcome that rise, or will it resist it with fear, cloaked in doubt? Because you can't claim to support democracy and fear a democratic nation's success. You can't celebrate freedom, then frown when someone freely chooses their own path. And you can't preach equality and then panic when someone finally reaches eye level with you. That's what this moment is. It's a mirror. It's revealing who's really committed to fairness and who was only comfortable when you were less than. But don't let that scare you. Don't let it silence you. Let it strengthen you. Because this isn't the time to back down. It's the time to rise up, not in anger, not in arrogance, but in clarity, in certainty, in vision. Because when the world starts questioning your worth, the answer is never to shrink. The answer is to shine. India's rise is not a threat to global order. It's a contribution to global balance, to diversity, to wisdom, to innovation from a different angle, to leadership born not of conquest, but of culture, compassion, and character. So let them whisper, let them doubt, let them wrestle with their discomfort. That's not your burden. Your job is not to make others feel safe in your shadow. Your job is to stand in your light. And for anyone watching, anyone sitting in a space where they feel underestimated, where they feel questioned not because they've done wrong, but because they're doing too well, remember this: they don't fear your chaos. They fear your clarity. They don't fear your weakness. They fear your wisdom. They don't fear your past. They fear the possibility of your future. So stop asking for applause. You don't need permission to be powerful. You don't need validation to be valuable. You don't need anyone else's fear to make your faith real. They never feared your struggle. They feared you would rise and stay there. And now that you're rising, you make sure they see it. You make sure they feel it. And most of all, you make sure you believe it.